Hi, I'm James Verdeer, and welcome to the American Institute of Biological Sciences BioScience Talks, which is a forum for integrating the life sciences. For this episode, I was joined by members of the Biodiversity Collections Network, otherwise known as BCON, who are here to discuss the BioFAIR project, which they describe in a recent BioScience special report entitled Integrating Biological and Environmental Data to Solve Key Scientific and Societal Challenges. It was a great chat, as are all conversations with the collections community, so let's go straight to the interview. Thank you all very much for joining me today.
Happy to be here, James.
Yeah, thank you, James.
Yep, happy to be here.
Great. So to get us started, since we have a rather large group today, it probably makes the most sense for you all to introduce yourselves. So I will go ahead and leave that to you in whatever order you would like to proceed.
Great. My name is Dori Contreras. I'm the Director of Paleontology and Curator of Paleobotany at the Perot Museum of Nature and Science.
And my name's Jyotsna Pandey. I serve as the Community Programs Director for the American Institute of Biological Sciences, or AIBS.
My name is David Kunkel, and I'm a PhD candidate at Oklahoma State University.
Hi, everyone. My name is Andy Bentley. I'm a collections specialist at the Biodiversity Institute at the University of Kansas.
Hi there. My name is Cameron Pittman, and I'm the Assistant Collection Manager of Vertebrate Zoology at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science.
And I'm Libby Elwood. I am the iDigBio Director of Education Outreach and Global Collaborations.
And I'm Greg Watkins Caldwell. I'm the Collection Manager of Ichthyology and Herpetology at Yale Peabody Museum.
All right. Thank you all very much. And as those who are listening might have gathered, we will be talking today about collections. And I thought it made sense to start us off, as we often do when we talk about collections, with a little bit of a primer on what collections actually are. So I leave that open to you, whoever would like to take that and give us a quick introduction.
Sure. So you can kind of think of collections, and broadly science collections, as being like libraries of specimens. And that can be anything from plants, dried or living, animal skeletons, skins, tissues, DNA, any living collections, fossils, soil, a huge array of things. And these libraries are essentially our physical records of life on Earth. And they tell us about biodiversity, they tell us about natural processes, geological materials, and kind of capture the environment around us.
Okay, and I'm imagining now that, those collections are now much more in the digital era than, simply samples that were collected and kept in drawers or something like that. What's the digital element like?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, you often have this classic view of collections as these things in boxes and jars and cabinets and these, big behind the scenes spaces. And while that is still true, we also have a lot more data about them now. And we get that data, the names of things, even genomic data, just all kinds of derived data from it as well. And we've put those online. So you have your digital collections of information that hark back to and attach to those physical objects that we still have stored in physical spaces in our traditional museums and universities and et cetera.
Great. And I'm wondering now about, though, how that data is used by researchers and, is it all interoperable? Does everybody, following the same standard, or are there a lot of different ways of doing things? How does that process kind of work?
Let's say that is the goal. That is what we're reaching for, but I don't think we're there yet, right? And this is one of the things that we're fundamentally trying to work towards and solve. So different fields have different standards, different, scientific disciplines, even different organizations, different institutions. So as we've moved from having just physical specimens that you could go look at in museums to having these digital records and then putting these digital records online, standards haven't been uniformly applied. Although that stuff is getting better and getting more standardized, but the information is a little bit siloed still. So if you want to find out about, say, the genetic record of certain specimens, but you also want to look at, say, what color they are, or study some aspect of their phenotype, you're often going to two different databases or physical places or digital places, and these records aren't well integrated yet.
So we do, as collections, we do share our information sort of globally with these things called aggregators. And so GBIF is obviously the big one, the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, where a researcher can essentially search thousands of collections all over the world, billions of specimens and observations, to be able to find out where these specimens are housed, where they can sort of request these specimens to be able to get them on loan. And as well as the digitization that we've done on the sort of primary digitization, which is just getting the metadata associated with these specimens. So what it is, where it was collected, when it was collected, how it was collected, etc. We're also now creating sort of these clouds of information around these specimens by digitizing other pieces of information. Images of specimens, images of locations where they were collected, CT scans, genetic information, publications where information has been cited, and sort of bringing all of that information together as a sort of cloud of information around each one of these voucher specimens to make them more useful for research down the line, not only for traditional taxonomic and systematic research, but also for new avenues of research, sort of branching out into global climate change and spread of disease and all of these kinds of things. And so there's sort of this primary and secondary digitization initiative that are ongoing at the same time.
Right. And I'm wondering now about how that plays into something that we've talked about on the show before in a previous podcast, which I'll link to in the show notes, which is, the extended specimen and the extended specimen network. Is that what you're describing right here?
Correct. So that's essentially the essence of an extended specimen network, is being able to link all of these pieces of information together. Currently, it's being done very sort of manually by us as collection managers, where we're sort of accumulating all of this information and putting it into our databases. But the ultimate goal is obviously to be able to link these resources together in technological space, so that you can link all of these objects together without having to physically create that linkage yourself. It will actually just be created in digital space. And then sort of the next step of that is then taking this extended specimen network and linking out to other sources of data. So ecological data, satellite data, all of these kinds of, new pieces of information that can make these specimens more robust and allow us to be able to answer all sorts of new questions with those specimens.
And to build off of those concepts that Dory and Andy have presented there, ideally each of those silos or those clouds of information are following FAIR principles so that they're findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And if they are following those, then it makes it easier for either individuals to do that manually, like Andy said, is sort of the way that we've been doing it so far, or it could happen in a more programmatic or automated way where that could happen at a much greater scale. So that's a longer term goal that we have.
Kind of a key point that Andy had brought up was that we have these primary and secondary objectives in the digitization of specimens, and that is happening at the same time, as he mentioned. So we still have many organizations and museums that are still doing that initial get their specimen information online so people even know it exists at that institution. But at the same time, we're trying to add these other layers, the images, other metadata, other things that integrate with it. So it's going on at different levels, at different places, and all at the same time.
Yeah, and as everybody is just sort of talking about all this specimen data and the other kinds of data that can be associated or linked with specimen data, this really, highlights the urgent need right now to sort of bring together different types of biological and environmental data, not just the specimen data, but all of these various kinds of data that we've been collecting and we've been putting up online to address some of the biggest challenges we face today. Things like climate change, biodiversity loss, emerging diseases, stewardship of natural resources, things like that. So even though we're generating this, massive amount of data, which is, digital, biological, environmental, media, much of it, as everybody said here, remains siloed. And unlocking the full potential of this data really requires intentional integration, making data fair and open, as we talked about. And that's where the idea of this BioFair data network project really comes in. So BioFair stands for Building an Integrated, Open, Findable, Accessible, Interoperable, and Reusable Data Network, or BioFair Data Network. So this project, again, led by Beacon in partnership with AIBS and funded by the National Science Foundation, really brought together a broad set of stakeholders through a set of online listening sessions and workshops to start to work towards a more integrated data future. So that's what that was the main goal of this project. The goal was really to, catalyze cross-domain discussions to explore not only shared objectives, but also to sort of foster collaborations to connect these disparate data sets that we're talking about into an integrated network of biological and environmental data. So, we really saw this as, we really saw the community engagement piece of this challenge as one of the first steps to making the broader data integration really possible.
That makes quite a lot of sense, and I'm curious now about how that project kicked off. What were some of the early steps like? How does this kind of thing get off the ground? Because I think those of us who are not intimately involved in this type of project, it's very mysterious to us, how these types of things actually happen. So I think we've got a good sense of the impetus. But what were the early stages like?
Yeah. Like Andy was talking about, the project really jumped off of this idea of the extended specimen network vision, which was something that Beacon has championed for years. It was something that we sort of elaborated in a 2019 report that came out of Beacon and AIBS through another NSF-funded project. So, the idea was, at its heart, BioFair is really about, the community building aspects of this, uniting data producers, managers, users across biology, ecology, and environmental sciences. It's really about, creating the shared objectives, breaking down the silos, and supporting this an inclusive data-enabled workforce for the 21st century. So, starting from that, we basically came up with this idea, and the main sort of idea was to understand both the technical hurdles to integrating very different kinds of databases, but also exploring the social hurdles to coordinating across research communities. So we set out by organizing 6 different listening sessions, which convened experts from domains like ecology, climate and environmental science, health, genetics and genomics, biodiversity informatics, as well as federal agencies, so government agencies as well, because they have different challenges within the federal domain. So we basically brought together all of these different communities as part of these domain-focused listening sessions, and then held a workshop to develop recommendations about making an integrated data network a reality. So that's sort of an overview. We'll delve into different parts of each of these, but out of this sort of broad process, one of the biggest sort of product, or the main product that came out, was this roadmap for how to move forward. And I'll let my colleagues kind of talk about some of this. But I do want to mention, a big part of this project was really, engaging some of the early career members of the biodiversity community. So, we started off this project by recruiting 6 emerging and early career professionals, and two of whom are part of the podcast today, David and Cameron. And these folks really joined the leadership and planning team for the project, and it's been one of the biggest kind of or the most heartening parts of the project, where we've seen these early career members join the project and take on leadership roles, and play leadership roles in everything, including planning the workshop, planning the listening sessions, executing them, writing up the report. So I think this has been a really sort of great opportunity for some of the early career folks to get involved and be a part of this broad community effort going forward.
Yeah, that sounds great. So, in terms of, the things you mentioned, one of them at the very beginning was the listening sessions. And I'm wondering, what those listening sessions were like, and how were they convened? Who did you have at them? How did that all get put together, and what was the experience like?
Yeah, so the listening sessions really represented, like you said, that first phase of this project where we're trying to just get some initial data about these different data communities, the federal agencies, genetics and genomics data, the One Health domain, ecology, climate and environmental data, and then biodiversity informatics, to get a sense for where these data communities are at in their current kind of stages of talking to each other as a community, where we can potentially help facilitate those discussions to bring those data communities together, and then kind of identify what common challenges that we as a scientific community more broadly can work on to build this BioFair data network and make it a reality across these data domains. And so for that, we brought together a bunch of career stages, from students to emerging and established professionals within those different data domains, which resulted in like 200 people over the course of those 6 listening sessions, representing like 140 organizations. And so Yeah, these were just really good opportunities to engage with those broader data communities that we as the collections community might not have been able to engage with otherwise.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So it sounds like one of the primary challenges there is that you're reaching outside of the collections community, and you're talking to folks that perhaps you wouldn't necessarily talk to on sort of that as frequent a basis. What was that experience like, and how was the experience of bringing them into the fold?
Yeah, so we were helped out quite a bit by our key domain representatives, which served as kind of liaisons for identifying people to invite to these listening sessions within each of the data communities. And so for like the climate and environmental data domain, which is the one that I focused mainly on, we had Ty Tuff and Ben Halpern were really integral to identifying people that fit into that climate and environmental space and would be really active in our discussions and be able to provide great insights into where that domain is at and where it's heading and what we can do to help. And so that just really links back to the main challenge of these listening sessions, which was knowing who to invite and kind of how to reach out to them, because finding that information is not necessarily easy when you don't know these people or know these organizations. And so that was kind of the primary challenge there with these listening sessions.
I mean, it is a common challenge, when you're trying to expand your outlook and trying to bring new people into the fold, in terms of understanding who those people are and how do you reach out to them? How do you make contact? Who do you know are those folks that are going to have the most to say or going to have, good ideas in terms of data integration? And so that was our first challenge. And so we used these domain representatives as a sort of key launching point for them to give us ideas as to who we should be engaging to make those discussions, constructive and worthwhile.
Yeah, I'd like to kind of add that was actually ended up, for me at least, being one of the more interesting and fun parts of this project, because once you started learning about and tapping into these different domains that weren't a part of your normal science world, just learned about so many vast areas of research and initiatives and data that's out there that it just had no idea about. And the digital landscape was even larger than I had imagined. And so it was almost overwhelming, but also exciting at the same time.
That's really cool. Just one quick question about these listening sessions, just so we can help envision them better. Was this the case of, you're all flying down to Cancun and getting together in a giant hotel, over the course of, 3 weeks or something like that? Or were these, sort of virtual sessions where you get everybody together in a setting like we are right now?
We wish we could have all gone to Cancun for sure, but no, they were all held over Zoom. I mean, again, one of the challenges of such a broad community is trying to get everybody, into the same physical space, which we realized very early on was just never going to happen. And so, Zoom is a wonderful tool for bringing these sort of people from disparate places all over the globe together in order to be able to hold these discussions.
That's great. And I guess the next natural question would be, what kinds of things did they tell you? What sort of challenges, are faced in the creation of a BioFAIR data network?
Yeah, that turned out to, of course, also be really interesting in these listening sessions. So even though each domain was very different, everyone's at a very different place in their digital landscape world and what kind of data they use and the questions they address with it. We kind of still were able to distill from those sessions some common themes. So there were things that came up in each one. That was the recurring issues. And one is that, we need to continue to enhance data availability. So like we touched on earlier, that's an ongoing process. It's getting data out there and making it available to everyone. And at the same time that we're making it available, there's addressing equity in data access. So both in making sure that everyone has equal access to it, but there's also fairness about the way data is shared and sourced and attribution for data use. A big one, of course, is that we need to improve our capacity for data integration. So there's a lot of technological things that go into that to being able to integrate it all together. The big need to establish sustainable funding models and sustainable infrastructure for this massive amount of data. So it's, not going to be free. And then also establishing standards and protocols for data use and stewardship. So that's something we're constantly touching on, is just those standards and protocols so that we're all contributing in ways that data can actually talk to each other. And then lastly is providing, the personnel piece, the training for best practices in the stewardship of data and the use of data. So you have to keep training and retraining and advancing that more to be able to keep everyone able to use these resources. But yeah, those in various ways, those were the main things that just we kept nailing on over and over again. And of course, more in depth than that, but yeah.
And I think, an interesting overlying piece of this was that we understood that there is clearly a big technological hurdle that needs to be overcome here in order to be able to link all of these databases together. But on top of that, there's also a social aspect to this. There's a social problem in terms of, the education and training that is needed to train people in sort of data stewardship and looking after data correctly and being able to publish data in the correct manner, et cetera, et cetera. But also in terms of, making sure that everybody is doing things the same way in order that these databases can be linked up and the data can actually be structured in a way where it is most useful and is able to be integrated together.
Yeah, that aspect sounds challenging, from a sort of a governance type of perspective. Is it difficult to get people to, agree to, for instance, do their data stewardship in a common fashion, or is that kind of thing? How do you address that sort of thing?
I mean, part of the problem is, we're looking at a difference in scale. When you look at these different the different pieces of data that are coming in from all of these different places, you've got specimen data, which is sort of a point on a map, exactly where that specimen was collected. But then you've got sort of satellite data and ecological data, which is in a completely different scale to the data that we're dealing with currently. And so trying to integrate these pieces of data together is extremely challenging. But, there are standards and best practices that people use to publish their data, and everybody sort of agrees that data should be fair. It should be available. It should be accessible to everybody. It should be published in a certain manner, et cetera, et cetera. It's just when you start talking about the nuts and bolts of how you actually integrate all this stuff together, you start getting all these differences of opinion as to how that's actually going to work and how this data is actually going to sort of form this landscape of information that can be accessed from any particular direction.
Yeah, that sounds quite challenging. I guess now it makes sense to talk about, what was next in the BioFAIR project. You moved on from the listening sessions into sort of a workshop structure?
Correct. So, using these 5 cross-cutting themes as a starting point, we then took these 5 cross-cutting themes and used them as a sort of framework to look at creating a roadmap of sort of, where do we go next after this? We invited a whole bunch of the folks from the listening sessions, the participants from the listening sessions, and then invited a whole bunch of additional people to both give presentations and to be parts of the discussions in the virtual workshop to start discussing these 5 cross-cutting themes in more detail. And starting to put together a roadmap of how do we sustain this effort of digital data integration, and how do we engage new partners? How do we engage the groups that we need to engage in order to make sure that this data integration is going to happen? We obviously discussed further these technological and social challenges that we have in terms of doing that. But the hope was that, we could bring everybody together and come up with a sort of actionable and adaptable roadmap that we could use to then integrate all this data together and make sort of the next step in terms of bringing all of this data together so that it would be useful.
Great. And who do you assemble for that effort? I mean, it's 200 people participated, I think you mentioned, in the listening sessions. But is the workshop and the development of a roadmap, I would imagine it's a smaller subset of that group of people?
Correct. Yes, it was a smaller subset. We obviously realized that having too many people at the table just wasn't going to work for this sort of effort. So we sort of looked at the listening sessions and tried to find those folks who were sort of most vociferous in their comments or had really good ideas. And then brought those folks together around the table. There were a couple of additional people. We put out a call for anybody who was interested in being involved in the workshop. And we had some additional folks who joined that call and indicated that they were interested in certain aspects of what we were doing. And so we brought those folks into the fold as well. So it ended up being, I don't remember the exact number, but it was sort of, between 40 and 50 people, I think.
That's great. And then the major activity of that effort is sort of going through and starting to develop that sort of roadmap. What does that roadmap look like?
Yeah, the roadmap was kind of a cool project to work on because I always think about the goals of a project that's this big. Having a clear and achievable goal is always what you want to go for. And so we kind of built this roadmap to describe these measures of like a SMART goal, which just means specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time bound. And we want to create a roadmap around this kind of idea. And so we split up that group of 50 to 60 or so into smaller groups. And we did this by doing a survey. So the survey was meant to let the participants pretty much choose which themes they actually resonate with the most. So that meant like whether or not they were, had a preference for the technological side of it versus the social, where everything still kind of mixed between. There was a lot of overlap that we saw, but then whittling it down to what they were going to specifically talk about was always really cool because, you love to put people into groups of strangers and have them talk about certain things. And that's kind of what we did with this, with all of the core needs that were driving the group, but then creating pulling from that to create cross-cutting themes that showed what we could actually manage going forward. So it was kind of cool to come up with all these different bullet points of like, okay, what did each group talk about and how can we synthesize that into a roadmap that looks a little bit different than I think probably most people think about roadmaps, because ours was both going into a time dimension, like, it's like, oh, going forward, how can we do this and how long will it take, versus what can we do now in smaller working groups to kind of go push towards the future.
So what we try to do is we try to break it up into a sort of time-bound kind of timeline of short-term goals, medium-term goals, and long-term goals. So, what can we achieve immediately with very little input in terms of money or people or time? And then what are some of the longer-term goals that are going to take us some time to achieve? And then looking at sort of creating a list of tasks of what those tasks look like and how they fit into that time-bound sort of timeline of the goals that we hope to achieve. And so, with a mix of those two things, we had spreadsheets that had boxes for people to fill out of all of the tasks and all of the sort of short, medium, and long-term goals. And we literally just had a free-for-all where we just had people typing in things and then used that to sort of distill this down even further to then come up with a number of recommendations and tasks from that exercise to decide where do we go next? How do we actually achieve this?
And the beautiful thing with the we that Andy and Cam mentioned is that it's really that original sort of 200 people and beyond. It's, thousands really. Each of those people represent much larger projects as well. So we're really talking about numerous communities representing all sorts of different kinds of data and people at various stages in their careers with all sorts of different goals related to research and education and policy and all of this. And so the we that will be accomplishing all of these goals and working on the roadmap is very broad in scope. And so while we will individually and as Beacon likely be contributing to various aspects of these, we really wanted to make it broad in scope so that people can tackle various parts of it, representing the projects that they do. So it's not just us setting forth the all of these new initiatives and infrastructures that will accomplish this. Is really very much a global effort.
That's great. And I guess a natural question then would be, what sorts of things are on the roadmap? What types of activities are going to be engaged in over, what sorts of timeframes? What can we look forward to?
Yeah, we kind of got all of the information together. It was a lot of tables. And when I say a lot of tables, I mean like there were tables of tables of tables. And what we did is to kind of pull that all together to create these sort of buckets of these large term goals that split up, of course, into other different bullet points. And those include like the stock taking and gap analysis, where we want to see, what are we missing data wise in terms of the landscape, in terms of the infrastructure, and trying to build that together. And then going all the way to the technological capacity building, which mostly meant like, what is the interoperability of the different systems we use with the different databases, and like investing in kind of the development of more sustainable databases and data structure integration going forward. We had best practices and standards, which I mentioned before, but just, mandating that groups, kind of come together and optimize the sort of standards that they use, and going all the way to education and training. Because, I learned about the extended specimen network when I was in school. And that was a really cool thing because I was like, I'm excited to see how far it's gone so soon, but also being a part of that effort going forward has been really fun to see. And then, we want to make sure that the next student that goes through can kind of be a data asset steward of good, strong digital asset management. And that's important for the training, for the educational standards, for the career pathways that kind of are set before us as we go into this new age. And then the last thing was community building, because of course, this was all about community building, investing in that human infrastructure, but also just kind of coming together and meeting new people. I mean, through this project, I've gotten to meet so many cool people that at conferences and other than that, it's been a really cool relationship to build. Of course, across institutions, we are doing similar things, but so far apart, thousands of miles away. But it seems like it's so small now since I've been able to be a part of this. And so we've kind of had that going into our future directions of this kind of broad recommendations, but they really just underscore the need for a sustained effort with this, where it cannot stop here. It has to kind of go up and up.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that gives us a good idea of the direction in which we'll need to head. I'm wondering, what's going to be necessary, what we'll have to feed into this process, for this effort to continue and for the roadmap to be achieved. What kinds of things have to happen?
So, the future of this BioFair effort really depends on sustained long-term investments. I think that's something that came up a lot in the discussions that we had throughout the project. But yeah, the sustained long-term investment is key, as well as cross-disciplinary collaboration. I think we need to be seeing more and more collaboration, both on the national scale in the US here, but also with our global partners. And the community-informed roadmap and vision that we've presented or developed as part of this process really represents a framework that a community of practice can essentially use to begin filling in the gaps that are in our current social and technological infrastructure to advance towards the development of this data network. And to make this a reality, of course, there are a lot of challenges, like we talked about. There are technical challenges, social challenges. And one key barrier, for example, with the collections community is that the specimen data itself isn't always complete or standardized. So we talked about, the need for more digitization, better digitization, cleaning up taxonomic names, using AI potentially to improve data quality. All of that is part of the solution. And we've already seen some momentum from the community listening sessions and the workshops. Now the challenge really is to turn that energy into formal collaborative pathways to bridge the silos that we talked about, making sure both technical interoperability and social responsibility are at the center of it. So one of the first concrete steps that we've talked about as part of our discussions is the creation of expert-led working groups. We have this roadmap and different parts of the roadmap touching on different aspects and different challenges. What we really need are these working groups of people and experts that come together, that really brings together technical developers as well as social scientists to map out the data landscape, things like cataloging tools, vocabularies and workflows. All of that is part of the discussion to identify what's missing, what overlaps exist, and where alignment is possible. So that's really the first part, but the groundwork to all of this is really critical, because it doesn't just make the data network more robust, it also feeds into the education and training. So, training is a key part of this. We need tailored resources that can help build the skills and the FAIR competencies that are needed to develop and sustain, the best practices around these issues. But also, part of this effort is that, aligning with ongoing and complementary efforts. There are other groups that are working on these types of issues, and there is progress that is going on various aspects of this data integration process. And maybe Libby, you can talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so sort of simultaneous to the BioFair webinars and workshops and listening sessions and all of that, a bunch of us have been envisioning an action center, a biological collections action center, which has a really similar timeline actually to the extended specimen network concept. So this notion of kind of collaborating on a national scale to organize all of these various activities that are encompassed in the roadmap. And so we're also kind of pushing that notion forward. And within that too, we are thinking about what's happening elsewhere around the country, around the world, and what can we, without reinventing the wheel, how can we work more efficiently, most efficiently as a community on some of these activities? And so when we think about what's happening elsewhere, the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, GBIF, the Atlas Living Australia, DISCO, the Distributed System of Scientific Collections, and Canada's GenArc, the Genomic Adaptation and Resilience to Climate Change Initiative, just to name a few projects that are demonstrating data integration at various scales. So we can work with them, we can learn from them, and we can build off of what they're doing to advance these greater causes of linking data and the communities as well, and thinking about other sorts of shared infrastructure building and cross-sector partnerships. There's the Bouchot Declaration, the DeSantis Roadmap, and EASL, the Environmental Data Science Innovation and Impact Lab, as well as the Zoo and Museum Network. There's a lot that we can learn too from how zoos organize their data. And if Greg wanted to chime in on that, he's very active in that community as well. So there's a lot that we can learn just within the people that we've already been communicating with and collaborating with. And so in no way are we starting at ground zero, but we also need to be very strategic in how we roll out some of these activities so that we can break down those silos and to be as efficient with that as we can.
Yeah, so the Zoo Museum Network, we've met to discuss cyber infrastructure, and there's a cyber infrastructure working group within ZooMu, and the goal being mostly to get zoo data out of silos and into a findable place. And so far we've got a few zoos who are now joining GBIF and some of the other aggregators, and I think there'll be some progress in that direction. So good stuff. And Cameron, I think you've worked with a zoo on this very same issue.
Yes, that is correct. Yeah. It's kind of easy because the zoo next to my museum is right next door, a parking lot across.
That is really cool. So it sounds like, one of the key things that's going on here is, this engagement theme and broadening engagement as you go forward and reaching out to more and more communities and really kind of pulling it all together in that respect.
Yeah, one of the things that was clear from the extended specimen network, from the diagram that we generated for the extended specimen network, is that there's all these sort of concentric circles. And you have the specimen at the core, and then you have sort of all of these concentric circles of information that is generated around that specimen. And so as you get further and further out in those concentric circles, you're starting to engage new partners, new kinds of data, new kinds of infrastructure that's associated with all of that to sort of create this extended specimen network and create this larger picture. And others are working on similar initiatives. There's an initiative in Europe that's being done by DISCO called the Digital Specimen. And so a group of us have all got together as an international group called the International Partners for the Digital Extended Specimen to start looking at ways in which we can collaborate to make this a reality and try and, join all of these pieces of data together to make this data integration system a reality. So, getting to the sort of outer limits of those concentric circles, you're starting to incorporate all sorts of new pieces of information from other domains, which is where BioFAIR sort of comes into effect, is trying to engage all of these new kinds of data that could potentially make our specimens more useful.
One thing I kind of want to center for a second, because I don't think we've got to touch on it, is really just the why we're doing this. And it's not just because we can. I mean, we are at this unique point where technology is now such that we can actually even dream and actualize an integrated data network, right? So this is kind of a new possibility. But really, it fundamentally goes back to what it allows us to do, the questions that it allows us to ask, the research that it allows us to embark on. So, we have big questions that are more than just about one organism or one place and space and time. And an integrated data network will allow researchers to be able to ask big questions that kind of reverberate through different data communities, that pull information together from different data communities to ask questions not only about our observations from the past, which are embodied by specimens that were collected long ago, but also allow us to use that data to predict the future and to kind of ask everything in between. And that's the kind of questions, those big questions about life, are the things that we can only answer with big data. And we have that data. We just need that data to be available to talk to itself, really, each other, and for us to be able to interact with it in fast and accessible ways.
Great. Thank you. I think that is a fantastic note on which to leave the conversation. I'm very grateful to all of you for your time today. And I would be a very terrible editor if I didn't mention that there is a wonderful special report about BioFAIR in BioScience, hot off the presses or up on the website, as it were. Thanks again. This has been fantastic. It's always a great day when I have a chance to chat with members of the collections community. Thank you.
Thanks, James. It was a pleasure.
Thanks, James.
Thanks, James.
Thank you.
This was great.
And that concludes this episode of BioScience Talks. Just a reminder, the journal BioScience is published by Oxford University Press on behalf of the American Institute of Biological Sciences and is made possible by the support of our members and donors. Thank you, and talk to you next time.